So let me ask you this. How can you tell that an ancient Israelite wandering in the wilderness is kvetching? The answer, of course, is simple. Their lips are moving. And why is it, do you suppose, that the Torah is so full of stories of our ancestors kvetching in the wilderness? If you've ever heard me give a devar before, you've no doubt heard me say that I don't think that there are any wasted words in Torah. You've also heard me say that I think that if you're reading the Torah primarily as a history book, then you're missing the most important point of our scriptures. Our scriptures are meant primarily to teach us things we need to know about how God wants us to go about living our lives here and now. It also strikes me that as much as Torah is filled with both high drama and what reads like dry rules and regulations, some really striking and dramatic insights can come from surprising places. I think this week's portion makes a good example. So what are we meant to learn about our time and place in the world from this week's episode of the seemingly endless kvetching of our ancestors? This week, we're reading Parshat Korach, which is the book of Numbers, chapters 16 through 18. The portion begins with the story of Korach, a grandson of Levi, who, along with a couple of his buddies, Datan and Abiram, led a major rebellion against Moses and Aaron. This wasn't just a trio of malcontents. They had 250 supporters, and not just mere ne'er-do-wells. They were 250 chieftains of the community. The Torah describes them as chosen in the assembly and men of repute. So what is it that has this huge group of pillars of the community so surly? Pitchforks and torches in hand, they marched off to confront Moses and Aaron, telling them, "You have gone too far, for all the community are holy, all of them, and Adonai is in their midst. Why then do you raise yourselves above Adonai's congregation?" Moses, of course, was chosen by God to confront Pharaoh and lead the people out of slavery and ultimately to the Promised Land. And Aaron, Moses' own brother, was chosen by God to be Adonai's high priest. To me, at least, that seems like a pretty strong set of credentials to use as a basis for asserting leadership of the people. Korach and his rabble, on the other hand, clearly feel that they and all the people of Israel are every bit as worthy because, as they point out, God has made the whole people holy. It's interesting, for reasons that I'll get into in a minute, that Korach is a Levite. Remember, the Levites are set apart from the rest of the Israelites, just like the Kohanim. The Kohanim, Aaron and his sons, are the priests, but the Levites are in charge of taking care of the tabernacle. It's significant that Korach seems to feel that even this important role isn't enough for him. Now Moses, by this time, is getting to be near the end of his rope with all the constant kvetching. So Moses tells Korach and his band that God will decide who should be fulfilling the duties of priests. Moses tells them to get out their fire pans and their incense and to make their own offerings to God, and Aaron will do the same with his fire pan. So the next day, the big incense off is all set to go. Korach gets the whole community worked up, and they all gather in front of the tabernacle to witness the big event. God appears to all the Israelites, telling Moses and Aaron to stand back so that God can blast every last one of them all at once. But, as he's done before, Moses pleads with God not to take it out on the whole community because of a few rabble-rousers who got everybody riled up. And it has also happened many times before. God relents and tells Moses to tell everyone that they had better put some distance between themselves and the ringleaders, Korach, Abiram, and Datan. Moses then says to the community, "If you want to know whether God sent him to do everything that he's done, then watch what happens to Korach and his buddies. If they die natural deaths, say Moses, then you'll know that Moses, he is a fraud. On the other hand, says Moses, if something extraordinary happens to Korach, Abiram, and Datan, then everyone will know once and for all that God has chosen Moses to be their leader." No sooner does Moses finish giving this speech, but the ground opens up and swallows Korach, Abiram, and Datan, and all of their households, wives, children, and everything that they owned. Then God sent forth a blast of fire to wipe out the 250 rebels with their fire pans and incense. So here we have one of history's earliest examples of play stupid games, win stupid prizes. Now, there are certainly some kinds of people who love to point at this portion and others like it because it's got the kind of wrathful God stuff that they like to lean on to disparage either God in general or the God of the Tanakh in particular. And to be fair, even we Jews don't like to dwell on God smiting people. We're much more comfortable with God the Creator and God the Redeemer than God the Smiter. And the story of Korach and the way in which God puts Korach's rebellion down in no uncertain terms could lead us to a discussion of the problem of evil. I mean, sure, Korach was way out of line, but why did the earth have to swallow up Korach's cute little baby goats? What did they do wrong? Now, if you know me, you know that I do like to talk about the problem of evil, but that's not actually what I find most interesting or compelling about this week's portion. In fact, I'm going to suggest that the rebellion of Korach is not even the most important part of the portion that bears Korach's name. So what else is in our portion for this week? The first thing is that Adonai orders the priests to gather up all the rebels' fire pans and hammer them into sheets to decorate the altar and the tabernacle. This is specifically intended to be a reminder to the people, and I'm quoting Numbers 17, verse 5 here, that no outsider, one not of Aaron's offspring, should presume to offer incense before Adonai and suffer the fate of Korach and his band. The next thing that happens is that the people are upset with Moses and Aaron, blaming them for the deaths of Korach and his followers. Once again, God gets frustrated and threatens to wipe the people out, and once again, Moses and Aaron intervene on the people's behalf. A plague spreads in the camp, and Aaron makes incense offerings in expiation for the people until the plague subsides. Then there's a really interesting episode where God commands Moses to gather up a staff from each of the leaders of the 12 tribes and to put them in the tent of meeting by the ark. God tells Moses that the tribe who God has chosen to be priests will be made known to everyone by which staff sprouts. In the morning, the staff with Aaron's name on it not only sprouted, but it had blossoms and almonds on it for good measure. God, through Moses, is making it clear that the Kohanim are the only ones who can do the duties of priests, and that the Levites are to be the ones who take care of the tabernacle, and that under no circumstances are they to mix up their respective roles. Then in Numbers 18, starting in verse 8, something that I find very interesting happens. God speaks to Aaron and says, I hereby give you charge of my gifts, all the sacred donations of the Israelites. I grant them to you and to your sons as a perquisite, a due for all time. Then God goes into minute detail about which sacrifices are for the needs of the priests and which are for God alone. And then in verse 13, God specifies, the first fruits of everything in their land that they bring to Adonai shall be yours. Every one of your household who is pure may eat them. Remember that God had previously told the Israelites that all of their first fruits belong to God. God also tells Aaron that firstborn children and other unclean animals are to be redeemed for cash, but the firstborn of clean animals are to be sacrificed to God. In verse 21, God says, and to the Levites I hereby give all the tithes in Israel as their share in return for the services that they perform, the services of the tent of meeting. God tells Aaron and the Kohanim and the Levites will not have a portion of the land like the other tribes, but that instead God is their portion, and of course all of the offerings brought by the other Israelites. By way of an interesting footnote, God does say that even the Kohanim and the Levites need to set aside tithes and first fruits from what they receive to be dedicated to God. At the beginning, I asked, what are we meant to learn about our own time and place in the world from this week's example of the seemingly endless kvetching of our ancestors? In Pirkei Avot, it says, turn it and turn it, for everything is in it. We read about things many times and we return to it over and over again because there are many things that we can learn from our scriptures. I think you could make a case that Korach's rebellion could be about any one of these important lessons. Maybe it's telling us that God's given each of us a role to play and that we need to work out what that role is and get on with playing it. Maybe God is reminding us that it's God's choice, not ours, what role we're each to play in putting God's plan into action. Maybe it's a warning not to mess with the leaders that God has anointed, like God exalted Moses and Aaron over the people and chose the Kohanim and the Levites for their special roles. Or maybe it's just a stark reminder that your boots ain't so big as you think they are and you should remain humble. Or just maybe, the whole story of Korach and his rebellion is just a setup for establishing the importance of a sacred community with designated helpers chosen by God as being the ones who are fit for and deserving of tithes and other offerings to God. But why does Torah use the word offerings here? Why not taxes? Why not dues? It's because these gifts, which God commands us as Jews to give, are different from these other things. God is telling us that giving to support the work of a sacred community is, in fact, an act of worship. I actually think that Christians do a better job than we Jews do at making the direct connection between supporting their sacred communities and worship. Christians use the word offerings, and they collect these gifts right in the middle of their worship services. That's making a much more direct connection than sending out an email once a year, which, by way of reminder, you should have received on June the 4th. So check your inbox and your junk folders. At the same time, there are many ways in which our way can be more practical. We are, after all, a pragmatic people. And as much as I admire the Christians' use of the word offerings, I also very much think that we Jews are dialed in with the word tzedakah, rather than how this is often translated into English as charity. What is the root of tzedakah? It's tzaddik, righteousness. Making offerings is doing the right thing. It's part of what we do to be right with God. Don't get me wrong, I'm perfectly delighted that the CRA lets us issue what they call a charitable tax receipt. That 40% leverage on giving is very helpful and very powerful. But I know that when I support Solel, I mean it as an act of righteousness, not as an act of charity. And charity is very important, and as it turns out, it's also something that God commands us to do. But I know that when I make a donation in my community to, for example, Food Banks Mississauga or the Trillium Health Partners Foundation, that it's not quite the same thing as when I make a contribution to Solel. It's also very interesting to me that God commands us to offer our first fruits. God doesn't say, donate your net profits, or whatever you have left after you take what you need. Think about what it means to give your first fruits to God. What if the first fruits turn out to be the last fruits? In an agrarian economy, you never know what's going to happen. The weather can change, any number of calamities can come your way. Offering your first fruits to God is an ultimate act of trust. By commanding us to offer our first fruits back to God, God is at the same time telling us not only that these offerings are of the utmost importance, but also that we can trust in God that our first fruits won't be our only fruits. In the wilderness, our portion tells us that the designated helpers of the sacred community were the Levites and the Kohanim. But how do we translate this divine message into terms that make sense to us today here in Mississauga? There's been no temple and no priesthood for almost 2,000 years. Obviously, for us, the way we organize into a sacred community is around the congregation and synagogue. So who in our community are the designated sacred helpers? Obviously, there's our rabbi, our director of education, our office manager, and even our custodian. But are these all the people that we need for Solel to be Solel? Or for us to do all of the things that we count on Solel doing for us and for our sacred community? The answer to this is obviously no. Solel wouldn't be Solel without countless volunteers, each dedicating their time, their talents, and their effort to make Solel happen. I could try to list all of the ways in which Solelniks volunteer their time and talents to the community. In fact, during my presidency, over 10 years ago now, I did set out to thank by name every single person who volunteered in any capacity for Salel within that year. It was not at all easy to do. When I was done, I had come up with a list of over 200 names. That's how many people it takes to make Salel, Salel. All of these people, all of you, make your offerings in support of our sacred community when you share the first fruits of your time and talents with Salel, in addition to your treasure. The temple is gone. There are no more burnt offerings making a pleasing odor to Adonai. The psalmist hinted, and our Reformed Jewish wisdom now says, that these things have been replaced with a contrite spirit and with prayer. But our portion is very clear that these burnt offerings to Adonai are only part of what the whole community is expected to offer in order to support those doing God's work for the sake of the community. In this week's portion, God is reminding us that a sacred community needs dedicated helpers and that everyone who is part of the community has a role in supporting the community. We know that there are serious limits on what we can each do as individuals, especially in these days of narcissism and mean-spiritedness and hatred and even outright open season on the vulnerable. It's especially important to come together as a community to do God's work in the world, supporting each other and the stranger in our midst. This is why God commands us to come together and form a sacred community so that together, with our dedicated helpers and our pooled resources, we can hope to take some meaningful steps in mending the world. So, why did Korach get swallowed by the earth? What was Korach's actual sin? He wanted the kavod, the glory, without doing anything to earn it. Moses and Aaron had done the heavy lifting that God had set out for them, while Korach just kvetched. We each have our parts to play in supporting our sacred community, each according to their abilities and resources. For us here today, we do this with our offerings of treasure, but also of time and talent. Whatever Adonai means to you, however you conceive of the divine, whatever being righteous, being right with the divine means to you, when you make an offering of your treasures, talents, and time, you're making yourself right with Adonai. This is only one of the many lessons of this week's Torah portion. Shabbat Shalom.